Hey guys, welcome back to this video series. Alright, so now that we have covered the basics of triggers and parameters, you know how every script in mod.io works. You should be able to go through all the code, read it, and understand the functions part of it at least. Maybe you don't understand quite yet the logic behind it, but we'll get to there. So today we're going to be discussing two things. We're going to be discussing variables and we're going to be discussing attributes. So just a quick overview of each of them. Let's just talk about what a variable is and what an attribute is. And I'm going to kind of define them in a similar way just so that it's more understandable. So for a variable, let's say it's something that changes. So it's some value. Let's be specific. Some value that changes when you change it. So that sounds kind of straightforward, but it's a really important tool to have when you're making games. And then an attribute is some value that changes when you change it, but also by itself. So what do I mean by that? I mean, if you want to make passive regeneration just means you want something to regenerate by itself. You don't have to constantly update the code to make it regen. You'd use an attribute. Because in mod.io, the attributes basically will automatically regenerate because they have a value to regenerate. So they can change without you having to do anything. With a variable, you have to constantly update it or write code in order to change the value. So that's kind of the differences between variables and attributes. And now there's a couple types of them that I want to discuss. So there's global variables. Okay, I'm just going to talk about the types of variables. So there's types of variables. There's global, there is entity, and there is I'm kind of blanking on the third one. But there's a global variable, which is basically a variable that the entire server sees. There's entity variables, which are variables for an entity. And then there are player variables. So now you might be wondering, because last time we talked about the hierarchy of the types, so player types, unit types, item types, and projectile types. You might be wondering why entities and players are different things. But that kind of comes down to the fact that entities are visible and tangible objects, so things that you can touch and see in the game. So players don't actually fall under that category. They are the controllers of the things in the game. So that's why players and entities are different things. So entities are units, items, projectiles. And players are players. They control them. So these are the types of variables. And now let's talk about the types of attributes. The types of attributes are, there's no global, but there are entity attributes and there are player attributes. So it's not as many as variables, but global variables are really important and we're about to get to using them right now. So I think that a really good way to use a global variable is to just have a script that I guess we can just constantly update it. So let's just say that we have some number and we call it um, we'll call it my number for now. So this is a global variable. Let's start the value at 0. So now we have my number at 0. And now we can go and we can create a brand new script. So let's just use some random trigger to get you guys exposed to different kinds. So I'm gonna actually avoid every second because that kind of script is really common in a lot of games, and I'm sure that some of you guys are familiar with it. But instead, I want to try to do other types of triggers, since it would probably be more useful. So we can probably do, okay, we can probably do unit leaves a region, or we could do unit gets attacked, projectile. Alright, I guess we could just use one of our older scripts. Since we already have some scripts, let's just use one of them. So right here, we have unit starts touching another unit. So instead of creating my projectile, what we're gonna do is actually let's leave that. But instead, what we're gonna do is we're just going to increase. So there's three ways to change global variables. You can either increase variable by number, you can decrease variable by number, or you can set variable. So if you ever need to just increase or decrease a variable by one or by constant number, then I recommend the increase variable by number. And then number, we can just increase it by 1. So now this is going to increase the variable by 1. And then let's just send a chat message to everybody. Instead of the owner of the last touching unit's name, let's just send the variable. So you notice that we never covered this, but whenever you have chat messages or even string types, you will have three options. You'll have manual input, you'll have variables, and you'll have functions. So functions, you guys can go through these and you'll find there's a lot of information, there's a lot of useful things. And as you get more seasoned and experienced with game development, you'll see a lot of these things are kind of useful. But for now, let's just do what we sought out to do, which is print out the number. So you might be noticing that there's no good way to um, access the number at the moment since we're not seeing it show up anywhere. But there is going to be a way to do it. I believe concatenate is a good way to do it. So right here, we can put manual input. So concatenate we covered before is basically just combine two strings. So a good way to use concatenate, a good rule of thumb is the first string should not be made of two concatenations. So if I want this first string to just be like my number, like this, I can put a space. So don't forget the space, you'll see why in a second. But we could just put that, and then the second one, if I want to make concatenations in concatenations, maybe I want a long message, then you can do that here. But since we just are looking for a number, we can put my number, and here we go. So it's going to print out my number every time two units collide. And so now that's kind of keeping track of how many collisions there are. So now you can see we have this player right here, and we're seeing in the chat, my number is now 14, and it's going up by increments of 2 each time. So no matter how many times I collide with other players, you will see that it's always going to go up by 2. And sorry for the spamminess. I'm sure you guys are noticing that whenever you make scripts, you want to have a way to limit the amount of chat messages that are coming out at one time. So what I'll do now is I'll start to get rid of a couple chat messages as we don't need them. So unfortunately, we're going to say goodbye to our unit touches wall script and the projectile touches wall script. And then in the colliding one, I'm going to just remove the projectiles. So there you have it. Right. Now we have discussed usages of global variables and we used one. So global variables, you see that they change based on global events. That's why they're called global variables. They're big overarching variables. They don't belong to one specific player, entity, projectile, or anything like that. But now you might be wondering, okay, what are player attribute? What are player variables? What are entity variables? So let's just do another example. But this time, let's create an entity variable. So inside of the player, if you go edit the player, you're going to see right here that there are animations, body types, attributes, variables, inventory size, and other things. So I'm sure you guys can figure out what these bottom three are. But right here, variables. These are entity variables. So what we can do is we can add a new entity variable, and we can just call it entity number. So now, let's set this to 0. And what we can do is entity number is going to be changed by 1, just like my number. But we're going to print out entity number separately. We're only going to print it to the unit touching, the touching unit. So let's just set entity variable and entity number of, and I believe that our trigger parameters are last touching and last touched unit. So let's go to last touching unit. And so one thing you might be tempted to do here is set the variable as 1, like we did in the other script, but that's just going to constantly set it as 1. So if I touch a unit once, it's going to be 1. But if I touch the unit again, it's still going to be 1. So what you want to do is you want to do some math. So this calculate function allows you to change the plus sign right here into these symbols right here. I'll go ahead and let you guys explore those. And it allows you to change these operands. So right here, let's get entity variable, and we want to get entity number of the touching unit. So be careful here. this might be an area where you might run into bugs. You might be tempted to use touching unit here and maybe touched unit over here, but these need to be the same one. So if you use touched unit, you can, it's okay, but make sure you use touched here and here. Just a quick side note. And then here, just +1. So this code, what it's saying is, take this last touching unit's entity number and increase it by 1. Alright, and now what we can do is we can send a chat message, but not to everyone, just to the player. So send chat message to player. So we want to send their current concatenation of entity number, and then space. So the reason we have the space is, as you saw in the chat previously, there was a space in between the number and the message. If you don't put the space there, then the number is going to show up kind of like that. But if you put the space, it's going to show up automatically like that. So that's why you want a space. And then right here, we put number, and be careful, you might be tempted to try to find it here because it's my number variable, right? But it's a entity variable. So that's a thing that a lot of people get confused by. Oh, which kind of variable is this? But as you develop games more, you'll get more accustomed to this kind of thing. So now touching unit, last touching unit. So now you're going to see that we have last touching unit. Send this chat message to the owner of that last touching unit. So now I'm going to stop explaining certain things that I've probably said way too many times for some of you to hear, since it should be easier to understand now. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to hide this message just so that there's less chat messages overall. Alright, fish, where are you? Let's find the fish. Oh, whoa. That's kind of funny. You're always in there, huh? Alright, well, you can see my number got increased a ton. But now if I touch the fish, entity number is 1. And if I touch this player right here, entity number is 2. Hey fish, go ahead and touch me real quick. Catch me if you can. Alright, what does your entity number say? Your latest one. Go ahead and type it. 2! So look at that. Our entity number became 3, but fish's entity number is 2. So this is proof. And if you guys ever want to test out your own player, I believe there's a option to add a secondary player into the game. Let me see if I can find that for you guys, because I'm sure a lot of you guys could use that. Okay, if you guys just look around, there might be a way to find a player that you can use, but for the most part, it's good to just go into an incognito window and then open a user up, and you can just test your game like that. So yeah, with Fish, we're able to figure out that we have this sort of scripting difference where I had a different entity number because I touched a different unit. So now you understand entity variables. We used one in an example. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and delete all of these entity variable scripts, and we're going to work on using attributes, or actually player variables first. Then we'll get to attributes. So now let's do some player variables. And of course, if you guys get the gist and you're kind of bored now, you guys can move on to the attributes part. But I'm just going to do this for the sake of showing you guys there's a difference between player and entity variables. So I'm going to call this player number. So let's call this number 0. Save it. And so now there's a player number, and it's a number. And it's in all of human players. So now, whenever units start touching, what I'm going to do is the exact same thing. This time I'm going to set player variable. So actually, what a good exercise is I want you guys to do this entire thing by yourself. What we're going to be doing is the same thing that we've done in the previous ones. So if you want to go back and check the code for those, go ahead and see if you guys can do it on your own. Alright, so I hope you guys tried it out. Now I'm going to show you my solution. So set variable player number of the owner. So you notice that this is going to be a little bit different this time. Instead of having touched unit immediately right there, or touching unit, you have owner because it's a player variable. So there's a couple differences here and there. And notice you still have to do the similar thing to entity variables. So player and entity variables are really similar in that you have to do their math in the same ways, but it's not very similar to the other ones, the global ones, since they have built-in number increment and decrement. So now you might see that we have this script, and then I hope you guys also added a chat message. If you did not add a chat message, go ahead and do that and run the code by yourself. Try it out with a friend, try it out with your own account, and just see if it works. And once you do, come back to here. Alright, so after you've tried that out, I hope that you guys are trying these things out. It's not to torture you or anything, it's just so that you guys understand more than just watching me do these things, because I'm sure you guys are going to get bored from me just talking. So now check this out. Player number space. I'm going to explain a couple things here a little less just because we should get the gist. I've got owner of touching unit. And then send this to who? That's right, the owner of the touching unit. So there you go. I'm gonna save and apply. And here we are. Hello, fish. Where are you at? There you are. Come get me. Just kidding. Here you go. And you might see a really interesting thing. Player number is undefined. So now, those of you that did not skip this entity number get to see something different. You're seeing that player number is undefined right now. And that might be really confusing because, wait a minute, we ran the code. Why is player number not changing? Well, let's go ahead and take a look at it. So we said set variable player number of owner of last touching unit as player number of owner of last touching unit plus 1. So why is that number not changing? Well, how about we take a look at player types and human players. What number did we set this as initially? We set it as 0. So clearly something should be happening. Well, this is a good time to show you guys that there's another section to our editor. It's called the reports section. If you ever have bugs, go here and it might tell you the bug that you're dealing with right now. And right now, you'll see that it's telling us right now that player number of owner of last touching unit is undefined. It doesn't exist. There's no player number for the owner of the last touching unit. So that's returning undefined, which means that there's a calculation error because undefined plus 1 is not a number. So now, this is not a place where you guys give up. This is a spot where you guys try to debug it. But let's just go ahead and take a look at the scripts and we'll see about possible debugging locations. So one thing that really helps me out is you have this kind of code written. Whenever you made brand new code, a good thing to do if it doesn't work but it looks like everything is working, the first thing you want to do is republish your game, because sometimes that issue is that the entire game needs a reset. So what we're going to do is we're resetting the game right now, and so Fish and I are going to join back real quick. So just give us a real quick second. Alright, let's go find the fish, guys. I hope the fish is hiding. Oh, fish, how do you always get there so fast? Now, look at that. You see that player number is fixed. So you guys learned an important thing. Player variables do not update unless you refresh the entire game. Okay, but yeah, player variables do not refresh until you update the entire game, and that's a really important thing. So if you guys have issues with any of these kind of variables or scripts whenever you're working with them, just try republishing the game. Sometimes that'll just fix it, flat out. And there you have it. So that's those are variables in mod.io. And you might have noticed we used a kind of easy example for all of them. I encourage you guys to try to use other types of variables. You might have noticed if I go into this variable section, I'm just going to show a couple of them that I use personally. Boolean, string, position, unit, item, projectile. So when you see Boolean as a variable data type, it means true or false. So if I click this, you'll get true or false values. When you have string, that's something that you can write. So it doesn't mean a number, but it means some text. So like hello. And then you have position. So this is the coordinates. You have unit. So unit is really important. Units are basically you want to gather some specific unit in the game and store it in this variable. The reason you would do that is maybe the player owns multiple units and you want to immediately access them in your code, but instead of having to go find them through really difficult looking scripts, you can just store them. So you can say maybe um, this is your army unit, and maybe you only have one army unit. So then you would store it in this variable, and whenever you go capture the unit, it's stored in this variable, and it just makes coding quicker. So that's a example of different kinds of variables. And all right, so now let's talk about some attributes. So let's start with entity attributes. Um, so you might have noticed last time we used a lot of player variables and items such as that, but this time we're going to be using attributes. So you might notice that there's already a couple built-in attributes here, speed and health. These are some basis attributes that Model has given the player so that it has a specific speed to move around with and a specific amount of health. So you might notice that health has a regenerate speed already given automatically. There's an initial value of 100, a value range. I'm not going to explain these too much because I'm sure they're kind of self-explanatory. Um, right here, these are displays. So I want you guys to go ahead and play around with these by yourself. You'll find out that they're pretty useful. Friendly, neutral, hostile units. So this is basically things that are configured in a player type. So if a player type is hostile against another player type, then this will only display for people that are friendly to you or people that are neutral. So maybe you don't want to show hostile people, but you want to show neutral and friendly people. That's that's where you'd use this. So maybe you want to only show health to your allies, not your enemies. And then display the value. So you might be noticing that there's display and then display value. This is like the actual number and this is like the health bar. And then color, and then these are decimal maps and things like that. And then there's a couple styles that you can mess around with too. So yeah, that's the health attribute. So what we're going to do right now is we're just going to mess with the health attribute. So now what we're going to do is every time a unit touches a projectile, you want to set the health as a value of 0. So what I want you guys to do right now is go ahead and create a script that basically whenever any kind of projectile arbitrarily touches any unit, you set the health of the unit to 0. So go ahead and pause the video. There's two ways to do it. I encourage you guys to use entity scripts for this one because we've been using a lot of world scripts. So go ahead and pause the video. Alright, so I hope that you guys made this with an entity script. If not, and it works with the world script, go ahead and let me know down in the comments. But yeah, let's just check this out. So this entity touches projectile. So this is a vague, similar name to what would happen when this trigger goes off. And so now what we want to do is set entity attribute, or actually, let's get into if statement logic right here. So let's say that there was different kinds of projectiles in this game, and we only want to set our health to 0 if we're touching a specific kind of projectile. How do we do that? If you think you know how to do it, go ahead and try doing it on your own. Alright, those of you that do not know how to do it, I'm going to give you a hint, and then I want you to try it out. Use this thing right here. It's called if else then. Alright, I hope you guys tried this out, but here's what we're going to do. We're going to use an if statement, and there's some conditions. So there's different kinds of comparisons. You might see there's a lot, but what we're looking for right now is we're comparing projectile types. We're trying to see if the type of our projectile is a my projectile, because that's the name we gave it. So projectile type. So on the left side, it's common to just put the projectile type of and then the trigger. So which trigger is this? Well, it's the triggering projectile. Because if you may remember, our script, I'll just go all the way out here. We were given the parameter triggering projectile, touched projectile. Similar to how units when you're touched are giving 2 times of the same projectile. Yeah. And now we have this. So just to show you, projectile type of last triggering projectile, is this equal to the specific type of projectile, my projectile? So we're checking, is it? And if it is, then I want you to set my health to 0. So attribute. And there's a lot of attribute stuff you'll see. Max, mins, but we want entity attribute value. So then we want attribute type health of this entity, because that's the player, we're in an entity script, as 0. So go ahead and try this out, and we're going to save and apply, and then see what happens. Alright, fish, if you touch a projectile, your health is going to 0. Now, you might remember we disabled creating actual projectiles. So what I'll do is I'll create a script that'll quickly generate projectiles. Um, let's just... Okay, I think the easiest way is to create a projectile at the position of our mouse cursor, because I'm sure you guys want to know how to control the player's mouse. So I'll just show you guys this. So create my projectile at position. This is a really important spot. Instead of using entity position, we want to use a mouse position. Well, mice are not a entity, so we want to use mouse cursor position. So get owner of this entity's mouse, because we're in an entity script. Oh, sorry about that. So just go ahead, this entity, and get their mouse cursor position, and apply 0 velocity at 0 radians. So velocity, speed, radians, or angles. I think I've gone over that. So now this is going to create a projectile every time we left click. So now you can see on the screen there are projectiles everywhere. So if I go ahead and make a projectile right next to fish, and fish, you walk into the projectile, what's going to happen? So go ahead, fish, walk to the right. Oh my gosh, fish's health went to 0. And on top of that, look at the second thing fish is demonstrating. Oh my, fish is demonstrating lag. But fish is also showing that health is slowly regenerating. And that's because of the regeneration value we saw earlier. So now we're seeing two things of entity attributes in play. Now you might be wondering how this applies to player attributes. Well, we could do a similar thing, but for the most part, human players don't use health per se for attributes. What most developers like to do is make a respawn timer, and they like to put that inside of a player type. So whenever health goes to 0 for a player, what a lot of developers like to do is create a respawn timer at 100 value, and then they like to add a regenerate speed, so maybe a positive one. So let me explain what's going on here. We have 100, which is the max value of this attribute, as the initial respawn timer value. Whenever this player dies, whenever the unit owned by the player dies, we're going to set their respawn timer to 0, and then it's slowly going to regenerate by itself all the way to 100. And once it hits 100, we can activate a script. And I want you guys to think, what script could we use to check if their attribute has reached a maximum value, a full value? Alright, so I hope you guys checked out the scripts. It's actually called when this attribute is full. So I'm going to just write the word full, and you'll see entity attribute becomes full. But that's not the one we want. We want player attribute. So player attribute. My apologies. We're inside of the entity scripts right now. That's why you don't see it. But yeah. So if we just exit out of here really quick, save our changes as always, and go to the script section. Now right here we can go to this new script and put in player attribute, or we can just type full. So now you see a player's attribute becomes full. Whenever this happens, you want to check, wait, which attribute is this? Is this health? Is this a specific one? So I want you guys to start getting into the habit of using if statements to check, is this a specific type of attribute? And there's a specific kind of comparison. It's called attribute type comparison. What type of attribute? So then you want to say, is the attribute type of triggering attribute equal to respawn timer? So now just to show you guys, this parameter is given. So I encourage you guys, whenever you're programming, just take a look at the trigger parameters that you're given when you use a certain script, just so you understand it. So right here, when a player's attribute becomes full, there you go. And now, what do? Well, we want to, let's just destroy the unit. Let's just get rid of them. So let's get rid of the unit that this player owns. But you might notice there's no way to access the unit of the player, because we know that every unit is owned by a player. But how do we actually get to this unit? Well, the way we do that is through this loop. It's called a for loop. So you can just type the word for, and then you're going to see a ton of for things. Well, basically, you want to go to for units. So not unit types, but units. And you want to pick the unit group for all units owned by player. And you want to say all units owned by the triggering player, because the player is the one whose attribute changed. And then you say destroy the selected unit in the loop. So selected unit inside of this loop is basically saying that we have this for loop right here. Destroy the unit that we're currently selecting in this loop. So if this player owned multiple units, then every single one would get destroyed. And then we want to, of course, set respawn timer. Set player attribute to 0. So we want to set the respawn timer of triggering player to 0. And oh, I just realized something. Did you guys catch my mistake? All of this code should actually happen when the player's health hits 0. So we have to create a new script real quick. When a entity's attribute becomes 0 or less. So this is the name of one of the triggers. So attribute 0 becomes 0. So when a unit's attribute becomes 0 or less, so this is actually unit. So make sure you guys are really specific with the names as always. And then let's just quickly run through. I'm going to assume that you guys understand the attribute type comparisons. So just attribute type of triggering attribute is equal to health. So that means health. Let's read this entire thing. When health is 0 or less, health 0 or less, then what we want to do is we want to destroy this unit. So destroy this triggering unit, but also set the we want to set the respawn timer to 0 of the owner. So we want to set player oops, some lag, but okay, set player attribute value, so set the respawn timer of owner of triggering unit as 0. And right here, you're going to immediately run into a common bug that a lot of developers are running into. When you destroy a unit, everything attached to it is lost. So this owner of triggering unit, well, unit was destroyed in the line just before. So this script is not going to do anything. And our player is helpless. They have lost control in their world. So what you want to do, simply just move it beforehand. So be very careful with these destroy scripts. You're going to lose a lot of control. So now let's go back to this player's attribute becomes full and respawn timer. What you want to do is instead of destroying the unit, we actually want to create a new one. So get rid of those. And you might be wondering, how do we create a brand new player for this? Well, what's easy to do is just going over here and copy pasting this. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to just create them just so you see how they're made. So what you want to do is you want to create a unit. So you can just type that. I want to create a unit and see what comes up. Create unit at position. Well, that sounds like what we want to do. So create unit homie, which is the unit name over here, for the triggering player, the one that had the respawn timer hit max, at a position. Well, where do we want to put it? It doesn't matter, right? So we can just say random position in region. And there's a region that's already built into the game. It's called entire map region. So you can just say entire map region. So random position in the entire map region. Facing any angle we want. 0. 0 is just a common angle. So we're creating a player. But there are a couple of things you have to do. You have to also make the camera of the owner of the unit track this unit. So just type camera, and you're going to find make camera looking somewhere, make camera stop tracking a unit, and tracking unit. So what we want to do is make it start tracking a unit. So make triggering player's camera start tracking. Well, wait, how do we get to this unit? Well, this is a parameter that you guys might not know about, but It's a parameter that's invoked when a brand new entity is created. It's called last created unit. So I'm going to show you all three of them, but basically this is last created unit. There are three of these kind of parameters, so I'm just going to show you them real quick. What's a good script that's going to have? Okay, we'll just use an if statement. This always has every condition. So let's just say created. So you're going to see there's three types of created: last created unit, item, and projectile. And that's because these are the three types of entities. So these created scripts are really important when you're working with a camera or when you're working with creating something and then doing something to it right afterwards. So just remember, last created entity is invoked whenever you create something the line before. And then there's one last thing we have to do. So this unit right now belongs to this player, and its camera tracks the last created unit. The last thing we have to do is, that's right, save and apply. I might have tricked some of you into thinking we have to do this thing right here, but we're gonna cover this in a future video, so don't worry about that right now. Alright, so now let's press play, and fish, where are you, fish? Oh my, there's the fish. So, here's what I'm going to do. Fish, I'm gonna have you walk into this bullet, and I want you to see if the respawn initiates. And if it does, please say yes. If it doesn't, please say no. Ready, set, move left. Uh-oh, looks like I also died. And it looks like there's nothing happening yet. Alright, so now we've run into a bug. Our player seems to be helpless and there's no way to regenerate when the bullet has touched them. So, let's look at our reports. Are there any bugs? There are no bugs. So that means we just wrote something and may have forgotten to do something. So let's look at our unit attribute real quick. Attribute type is health. Then what we want to do is set the respawn timer as 0 and then destroy the triggering unit. So this is going to initiate respawning right here. And now when a player's attribute becomes full, create homie for last triggering in this area and make their camera track them. So, fish, are you in the game right at this moment? Because if you are, then please say yes. So now we just learned something. We learned that fish has actually already been created, but they just cannot track their own camera. So, when in doubt, publish the game, because we did have something and it should fix it. Oh, I noticed that fish refreshed, so that might not have been the case that I discussed. But now we are republishing, and we will try out this new aspect and see if it changed anything. So, where are you, fish? Hello, fish. Whoa, the fish is always there. Oh my, player number seems to be undefined again. Alright, we'll get back to that in a second. Oh wait, player number has been deleted. That's why. We changed player number to unit type. So, I'm going to go ahead and walk into the bullet, and let's see if we initiate. Look at that. We didn't change any of the code, all we did is republish. So sometimes the biggest thing that you guys need to do is just republish. And now we have a brand new game where we just create dots and then entities die from them. Quite an interesting game. Might not be the most fun, but it's really interesting what you can do with just pure code and rather than just using aspects of the environment. So now you guys have messed with player attributes, you've messed with entity attributes, and all the kinds of variables. So I hope that this video really helped you guys, and I'll see you guys in the next one.